All right, so good afternoon. My name is Jin Han Kai. I'm a faculty member of the Department of Economics, Finance, and International Business. And today, it is my great honor to welcome Professor Feenstra to our campus and give us a lecture. Professor Feenstra holds the Byron Cameron Distinguished Chair in International Economics at UC Davis. In the past several decades, he also directed the International Trade and Investment Program at the NBER. Professor Feenstra has published over 100 articles and 15 books in international trade. His research has been supported by the NSF, the Ford Foundation, and the Sloan Foundation. Professor Feenstra delivered distinguished lectures, including the Zutzen Lectures at the University of Copenhagen, the Olin Lectures at the Stockholm School of Economics, the Yan Fu Memorial Lecture at Peking University, and the Frank Graham Memorial Lecture at Princeton. He has won numerous awards throughout his career, including the Bernhard Harms Prize, the Herbert Young Society Dean's Fellowship, etc. Professor Feenstra has been extremely well known worldwide in the field of international economics and international trade. And today, he is going to give us the lecture titled The Regional Impact of Import Tariffs in the United States. So let's welcome Professor Feenstra.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's certainly nice to be here. So I'm talking about the regional impact of import tariffs in the United States. By regional, I really mean the impact on states, which surprisingly isn't covered that much in textbooks. We tend to look at the country as a whole, and honestly, that's kind of boring. We really are interested in what's happening at the state level, and your politicians care what's happening at the state level. So just before I start, how many people here have taken a course in international economics? International trade? Yeah, fair number. Okay, doesn't matter if you have or haven't. I'll be reviewing some material from that, but pushing it forward from there. How many people are coming to the lecture tonight? Few? Okay, good. Doesn't matter. Either way is okay. Some of the material is the same. There's a little overlap, but it's kind of pitched in a different way. In this lecture, I'll be showing you some material I would teach in my course, and some new material that I want to introduce in my course, with some diagrams that we use in international trade. Tonight, no diagrams, of course, right? Different kind of after dinner talk. Okay, let's get started. Here's something from the news. Who can tell me what that is from the news? Somebody knows from the news. I know you don't watch much news. No, Ed can't answer. No. It's got to be a student answering. Did I see his hand? Yep, please.
There was a panda in the zoo that was exported out to China. Was it China?
Sent back home. Yeah. It was actually two, male and female, and their cub, sent back home from the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. just yesterday. The zookeepers say it's because they were old, and they're always sent back to China when they're old. But other people say it's because we're kind of at a low ebb in diplomatic relations with China right now, and there's evidence to support that. Whenever there's these pandas, giant pandas are all over the world from China, and when China isn't so happy when with the country where the pandas are, then they get brought back home. They're only loaned for short 3 or 5 year contracts, and so that's kind of what's happened here. So why did this come about? Well, why don't we just start with President Trump? Okay, former President Trump and his administration put on lots of tariff. Who can name me one tariff or country that Trump applied tariffs against? Please. China, big time on China. Okay, one product, anything else? They weren't all against China. Some were against specific products. product formerly built, made here in Pennsylvania? Justify, oh, please. Steel, big tariff on steel. And I'll show you some other ones too, okay? So tariffs against China, tariffs on steel and other products. Okay, harder question, what has President Biden done about these import tariffs? What do you think? Same person. Want to guess?
Wrong guy.
Wrong guy. That's okay. That's totally fine. Any other guess? Uh-huh.
He's increased basically protectionist sentiment around microchip production.
Very good. Yes. He has actually increased, not quite tariffs, but protectionism in some other products, like not allowing us to export high-tech equipment to China. So he's not exactly on China's side. You know, on the steel tariff, I'll come back. He's taken off the steel tariff against some countries where it never really should have been applied in the first place, like my birthplace, Canada, right? Canada and the US are in a free trade agreement, you know, US MCA, US Mexico Canada free trade agreement, but Trump still put the steel tariffs on against Canada on grounds of national defense. We need that steel from national defense, which kind of makes Canada sound like an enemy, like we wouldn't help out the United States. So the Canadians weren't too happy about that. Same thing with the European Union. Steel tariffs were put against the European Union. Those have been taken off by Biden. So he's undone some tariffs, but he's added some protectionist sentiment elsewhere. Okay, last question. What do economists think of the use of import tariffs? Thumbs up? Thumbs down? Thumbs down. Let's see a few thumbs down. They really dislike import tariffs. And if you haven't already seen that diagram to explain that, I'll show you that diagram. But because I want to say what happens at the state level, you know, we always see this diagram, why import tariffs are bad, what's the deadweight loss. That is just not true state by state. State by state, some states are going to gain from import tariffs, some states are going to lose from import tariffs, right? So you could expect your elected representatives to have quite different views on the impact of import tariffs depending what state they're representing. So we'll see that. That's kind of where I'm heading. Okay, so here's a few details on the tariff against China. So Trump started to put it up in July 2008. This blue line is U.S. tariff on Chinese goods, so it was low, 3.8%, sort of twice as high as China, but still pretty low. But as soon as Trump started increasing, China did exactly the same thing, these red lines, that the Chinese tariffs. So they just went up in lockstep with each other, maxing out here at about 21%, you see there right at the end, still in place, okay? So that shows you about tariff retaliation. Here's some particular products that Trump put tariffs against: washing machines and solar panels, steel and aluminum, that sort of went together, and a lot of tariffs against China. And these are only the big cases. I'll give you some more examples as I go along of smaller products that we import much less of that Trump put tariffs on. Here were the initial tariffs in 2017, just as Trump took office in the first days of 2017, very low. Here's what he raised them to in 2018 or 19. And here are some trade laws governing the use of import tariffs. The president does not have the right to put on import tariffs all on their own. Okay, the president has to seek authority to do that from U.S. trade laws, and the different parts of U.S. trade laws are called sections. These first two here, section 201, that's basically a section that says if foreign imports are coming in such increased quantities as to cause or threaten material injury to your domestic industry, and if imports are really the most important cause of that injury, then you can put on a temporary tariff. You know, you can see I almost have that legal language memorized because I taught this so much. So that's Section 201. So those are temporary tariffs. Those were put on by Trump. They're already gone because they're temporary. Steel and aluminum were justified by Section 232, and that's this national defense provision. Very rarely used in the United States. I mean, it's just hard to think of stuff that we have to not import to protect our national defense, right? To make sure that we can produce it. But Trump used this, and as I said, used it against all countries, Canada, European Union, everybody. Of course, the other countries did not like this, and they retaliated. I'll show you in a minute. And then the final, Section 301, a special provision of trade laws that says if there's a foreign country trading with us and we think that they are involved in discriminatory practices against the United States, we can put a tariff on them. So this is the kind of thing Trump loves, because he thinks all foreign countries are involved in discriminatory practices against us, right? You know, and so that's how he justified the China tariff. Here's an example of some of the foreign tariffs that were put on in retaliation. So at the top we have China, so I already showed you that, how those Chinese tariffs went up, right? That was those red and blue lines. But then we got all these other countries, Mexico, Turkey, European Union, Canada, Russia, India. This is all in the steel and aluminum case. So that's what some of their, they put tariffs not on steel and aluminum, those were our tariffs. They put tariffs on a variety of other products the United States was exporting to them in retaliation. And of those products that they put tariffs on, those US imports, that's what their initial tariffs were, and this is what they became. Actually, the last one, India, is a great example. They tried to target products that would really hurt some congressperson. So they put tariffs on apples produced in Washington State, Eastern Washington, big apple growing region close to where I grew up in Vancouver, Canada. So they put those tariffs on apples, and those have only recently been removed, right? Other countries put tariffs on different things. So that's some of the retaliation. And then if we say, you know, was Trump alone? Not really. I mean, he used tariffs much more than other presidents, but virtually every president has used tariffs sometimes. Again, they have to get authority for that from US trade laws. So here's President Obama. Over 1,000 American workers are working today because we stopped a surge in Chinese tires. So that was a Section 201 case where Chinese tires were surging into the United States, causing injury in the tire industry in the United States, and he got authority to put on a tariff. Here's a cartoon that was about that at the time. And that tariff was specifically applied only against China. So it was kind of a discriminatory tariff in that way. Normally when you put a tariff on, you're just going to put it on all imports of that product. This was a special section of trade law that allowed us to put that tariff just against China. Okay, so that's sort of an introduction about the use of tariffs. So now I want to get into some of the material, the way I would teach tariffs in my own class. Some of this you've seen, maybe you've forgotten, right, or not, either way. So let's have a look. So I got to review some of the concepts that you've seen in your intro economics, your microeconomics. You've seen it again if you've done international trade. I'll go over this because this is a way for me to calculate what the costs of tariffs are for a nation. And then I want to extend that and push that to the state level, right? And show you that at the state level, you know, tariffs aren't always bad, right? You get different answer depending on the characteristics of the state. But let's start just with the basic analysis. So we start with consumer surplus. So here's a demand curve, standard demand curve, and at the price P1, we have demand of D1. But then we ask the question, well, what really, you know, do these consumers buying all these units, what's it really worth to them? For example, this person buying this very last unit, D1, if you charge them a little bit more than P1, they wouldn't buy it anymore, right? They'd drop out. They wouldn't buy that unit. So P1 is the value to that very last person buying it. But for early buying it, this person buying quantity D2, you could actually read the value they put on that good off your demand curve at P2. At P2, they would still just be willing to buy it. So this difference here between P2 and P1, that's the surplus for that particular consumer buying that good, right? They get surplus over and above what they're paying. And you repeat that exercise for all the earlier consumers buying this good, back from D1, all those units bought back to the first one, and you get all these vertical lines underneath the demand curve, and you add it up, and you get that triangle under the demand curve and above the price P1. So that's consumer surplus, right? So that's how economists measure the gains to consumers from having this good available. So you got the same idea on the producer side, right? We don't use it quite as much. It's not quite as familiar. And that's producer surplus. Think of it as a return to capital in the industry, right? You've set up your factory, you've invested capital. You're not a monopolist, right? This can be a competitive industry, but your capital is going to earn some return. We're going to measure that by producer surplus. So what's the idea? Well, let's start at this same price P1 that I had before. At that price P1, here's the supply curve for the industry, which we think of as a marginal cost curve. You remember from your whatever economics, with perfect competition, your marginal cost curve is your supply curve. So at this price P1, if you're producing this supply S1, then the marginal cost of that last unit you're producing, cost of that extra unit, is exactly P1. But now if you go to some of the earlier units like S0, the marginal cost of that, we'd read off the supply curve. It's lower, right? Because you still got the same amount of capital, but you're producing less. It's easier to produce. So the marginal cost of that is P1. So this gap between the actual price and your supply curve, that's the surplus to that firm producing that quantity S0. And then you can repeat that for all those earlier quantities produced. You got all those vertical lines, that gives you your producer surplus triangle, okay? So that's consumer surplus, area below the demand curve and above the price, producer surplus, area above the supply curve and below the price. So let's put those together. First, I'll have an economy with no international trade, and then I'll have an economy with international trade. So with no international trade, we got to have supply equals demand. I say this is a no trade equilibrium. I mean no international trade. There's nothing coming in from abroad. So just like any market you're familiar with, you just make supply equals demand. Here's your price. You got this triangle of consumer surplus. That's how much better off consumers are from having this market available. So, if this is smartphones, you're much better off from having them available, even if you spend whatever hundreds you spend on the phone, your value of that phone is still much more than the amount you're spending. And producers are also better off by being able to produce and sell that phone at that price. So that's your consumer surplus and that your producer surplus. This is imagining this cell phone was actually manufactured and produced in the United States, which is very unrealistic. In the absence of international trade, that's about the best you can do. Just make supply equals demand, and you get your consumer surplus and producer surplus. But now suppose there's international trade. So I introduce a big world out there, and I've got some world price that you can import this good at, right? In fact, our smartphones are imported, produced abroad at lower wages and so on, and imported. So now you got this lower price you're going to buy this good at. So the price has dropped from this initial domestic price there, PA, down to this world price. So that's PA in the absence of any international trade. Here's the world price. You can definitely see consumer surplus has gone up, right? Used to be this blue area here, that's repeated here. I call that this little area A, but now you got B plus D. So consumer surplus has gone up by exactly this area B plus D. That's, of course, at the expense of producers. Producers get a lower price. Prices drop from PA to PW. So producer surplus has fallen from your initial triangle, which was B plus C, down to just this triangle C. So consumers have gained B plus D, producers have lost B, you walk away with D. So that's what I showed down here. You got a rise in consumer surplus of B plus D, fall in producer surplus of B. Net effect on what I call welfare at home or total well-being is this area D. That's your gains from international trade. So maybe you've seen this diagram before, maybe you haven't, you've forgotten it, maybe you haven't seen it. No problem, that's just one way to measure the gains from international trade. So that makes us about 1/3 finished with all my supply and demand diagrams here, but there's still some more to come and some new ones. Okay, so now let's put on a tariff, like Trump did, like Obama did, like presidents before him have done, like Bush has maintained in some areas. Okay, so here's your world price. Just copy that. That's your free trade price. And now you put on a tariff of $T on this good. That's going to raise the price. Tariff has to be paid at the border in order for the good to come into the country. It's no different than an excise tax on gasoline. When you pump gas at your gas pump, you're paying a state excise tax and a federal excise tax, and those are all reflected in the price you're paying for gasoline, whether you know it or not, right? You can actually find it if you look at the pump really closely. But that's all reflected in the price. So this price is going to go up by the amount of the tariff, so that's your free trade price plus the tariff. And imports also fall. Here at the free trade price, demand was up here at D1, supply was at S1, so the difference between those was your initial imports. Now at this higher price, demand has gone down here to D2, supply's gone up, home supply's gone up because the price is higher, so imports have fallen to M2. So you got a higher price and lower imports. Okay, so now I'm going to lean on you a little bit. I want to figure out what's happened to welfare with this tariff. Why do economists dislike tariffs so much? So our price has gone up from PW to PW plus T here. And I'll just label some of these areas A, B, C, D. Don't worry about the colors for now. Those will become important later. Just ignore that. It's just a labeling of areas. Price has gone up from PW to PW plus T. For sure, consumer surplus falls. Right? Consumer surplus area below the demand curve and above the price, but the price has gone up. So what's the fall in consumer surplus? In terms of these areas, A plus B plus C plus D. What's the fall in consumer surplus? Please.
A.
A is a good start. A is an excellent start. A is included in the fall in consumer surplus, right? What is A, right? It's that increase in the price. But that's actually the increase in the price just for the stuff they're buying from home, somewhere between S1 and S2. They're also importing stuff at a higher price. So that higher price applies to home production and import. So A is an excellent start. How much more do we want to add on to A to get the fall in consumer surplus? You want to take another crack at it? No, that's okay. That's fine. That's fine. What do we want to add on to A? Almost any answer is right here.
D.
D I like. D I like quite a bit. Let's add D to A. D is a very interesting area because it's this increase in the price that have forced some people to exit the market. Right? So you put a tariff on solar panels like Trump did, fewer homes are going to get solar panels on their homes, right? You're shifting production to the United States, but some people will not get solar panels. So that's this area D. That's actually the loss for those consumers who exited the market. But we still got a little more. We got A and D. How much else do we have in the,
A plus B plus C plus D.
There you go. A plus B plus C plus D. It is the whole area. A plus B plus C plus D, right? Because that price is increasing on your domestic goods, it's increasing on your imports, you know, and it's that area D. That's that increase in the price that forced some people out of the market. It's just that whole shebang there. Okay, A, B, C, D. So that's the drop in consumer surplus. Producer surplus rises because the price has gone up. This is for home producers, right? They can, you know, think of this tariff on solar panels, price of imported panels went up. Now US firms can sell at a slightly higher price by the amount of the tariff. They can sell more solar panels. They're better off. They are better off by exactly, give me your same answer again. A it is. A it is. They are better off by exactly A, right? That is the rise in producer surplus. Because remember, producer surplus area above the supply curve, below the price, their price has gone up, right? So they're better off by exactly A. But we're not quite done because you're collecting some import revenue. President Trump loved to collect import revenue, right? He was always talking about the import revenue collected by tariffs. So we got to figure out what import revenue is in this diagram. It's going to be the amount of the tariff times the amount of imports. Okay, this is the last question here. Anyone want to take a stab on this?
Let's go out on a limb and say C.
C. C it is. Tariff revenue is C. That's the amount of imports. Remember, this is that lower imports, different between D2 and S2, times the amount of tariff, which is how much this went up. So government revenue increases by C. So now we just want to add this all up, okay? So I'll just kind of redraw that diagram a little bit bigger. We had a fall in consumer surplus of A plus B plus C plus D. We had a rise in producer surplus of A. We got the rise in tariff revenue, new revenue. I'll just draw that in yellow, that's C. And then if you just, you know, the consumer surplus is a minus, these are pluses, add this all up, you still got a minus B plus D, right? And that's those two red triangles. That is the deadweight loss of a tariff. That is the deadweight loss of a tariff. You are collecting revenue, but you are inherently losing more than the revenue you collect, right? Consumers lose a lot. Even if you took that as a minus and you added producer surplus, right? If you take that minus number and add producer surplus, you still got B plus C plus D. Add C to that, you still got minus B plus D. So it's just the inherent logic of this tax, like lots of taxes, you're going to end up with some deadweight loss. It's not exactly like money out of the government pocket, it's sort of money out of consumers' pocket. Or it's not even money out of their pocket. I really like that answer that was highlighting the area D. That is the loss to consumers who leave this market, who don't get that solar panel on their roof because it's too expensive. They've suffered a loss due to that. You know, so that's the way to think of deadweight loss here. So that is the reason economists dislike tariffs right there, right? You know, the revenue gain just doesn't justify the losses on consumers. The gains to producers just doesn't justify the losses to consumers. That is basically it. It's, let me just give you a couple of other examples of tariffs that were used, just to take a break from these diagrams, and then we want to come back to this. Here's another tariff that Trump put on. New Trump tariffs were put on Scotch whiskey, French wine, and Italian cheese. So this was in 2019. And here's the story about it. So Scotch whiskey, French wines, Italian cheese about to become much more expensive after Trump imposed some $7.5 billion worth of tariffs on these European Union, EU goods. New tariffs of 25%, his favorite number for tariffs. He said that even when he was running as president. And they add to those tariffs of 25% on steel and a lower tariff of 10% on aluminum. U.S. is the EU's biggest export market, so this is significant. The EU responded by saying it would impose its own tariffs in due course on the U.S. airplane manufacturer Boeing, which is, of course, a big export product from the United States. So it's another example of a tariff that was put in place. So let me show you now some estimates of the actual cost. We got that area B plus D, right? You know, keep that in the back of your mind. So here's for the Trump tariffs of 2018, and then for total tariffs of 2019, so that includes the 2018 tariffs. This first estimate is consumer surplus loss plus producer surplus gain, right? So the consumer surplus loss was bigger, so that's basically minus B plus C plus D. And there it is, 52, that's billion, right, in 2018, 100 billion, so that's the annual cost in 2019, including those new tariffs. Yes, you raised some revenue, something that President Trump always liked to look at. He says, oh, foreigners are paying those tariffs, right? They're paying at the border, right? You know, and yes, you raised some revenue, 36 billion here, even a little less here. I guess the tariffs were a little higher, so you were shrinking the amount of imports. You're raising even less revenue. And when you add those together, you still get a minus. That's your deadweight loss. 16 billion here, 80 billion per year using these 2019 tariffs. If you actually divide by the number of households, which is 127 million in the United States, you get a per household cost of $132 here, $620 here. Might make it sound kind of trivial, you know, but elections have been lost for smaller amounts of money. You know, I'm in California. When the governor put increased the tax rate that we use to register our cars by like 20 or 30 bucks, he was gone, right? You know, I mean, that is still, if you impose that kind of tax on all your households, that's still a big deal. Okay, so this is sort of the economist line. Tariffs are bad. I remember learning this when I was, you know, an undergraduate at University of British Columbia. And I was never like completely satisfied, because then the next question is, okay, so why do most presidents use them? Why do most presidents use them? So we got to take that step. There are some answers. Oh, sorry, this is just highlighting some of these numbers. So first answer, it is a source of revenue. Trump liked it a lot for that. Developing countries often use tariffs as a source of revenue. The United States during the Civil War had extremely high tariffs to raise revenue. Okay, we don't think it's a very good way to raise revenue. Developing countries do it because no one will file income tax returns, right? They just not have a well-developed system to tax firms or tax consumers. So at least for import tariffs, you can do it at the border. You know, and you can watch this stuff when it crosses the border. So in some sense, it's easy to collect. But in more developed countries like the US and Europe, we don't think it's a very good source of revenue. Put on an income tax, right? It's much more broad-based than just taxing particular import goods. Or put on a corporate, either individual income tax, corporate income tax, fine. Keep them very broad-based. In Europe, they also have value-added taxes. So we just think that's a better source. So we don't think that the first source is a reason to use tariffs, but not a great one in the United States today. Oops, but then we come to the second reason, politics, which is a compelling reason, right? Maybe Trump wants to put on tariffs because he genuinely prefers producers of steel to consumers of steel. So that's possible, but consumers of steels are also firms. I mean, eventually, we consume steel as households from the stuff we buy. But when you put on that tariff on steel, you're trying to help the steel producers. You're hurting the auto industry, right, which uses steel as an input. You're hurting tons of industries that use aluminum, right? So it's not obvious that you would prefer producers to consumers, especially if consumers are industries, but sometimes we think that's what firms are doing. But sort of a sharper version of that reason, maybe you're buying votes in certain states producing that good. So President George Bush, now we go back a few decades, he put a 2002 tariff on steel, and that was promised during the 2000 campaign, and he was trying to buy votes in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, steel-producing states. Here's a quote for him. "I take this action to give our domestic steel industry an opportunity to adjust to surges in foreign imports, recognizing the harm from 50 years of foreign government intervention in the global steel market, which has resulted in bankruptcy, serious dislocation, and job loss in the U.S." So this was also a Section 201 tariff, justified by the surge in imports that was causing problems in the United States. So he put this tariff on in 2002. Here's a cartoon from a little earlier. It was a 2002 tariff, but this was the 2000 election. Here's George Bush, tariff. "Hi, I'm George Bush and I'm running for re-election." Oh, never mind. They won't vote for you anyway. Anybody here know if George Bush won Pennsylvania in 2000? I had to look this up. He did not. He lost to Al Gore in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania being a swing state. George Bush won Ohio, and so won Indiana, one other steel-producing state. So this steel tariff could have helped for him. And that's certainly why he put it on. So what this brings me to is sort of what I want to add to the standard analysis of tariffs. I want to be able to say, what are tariffs doing at the state level? So it's going to be a little extension of what I did. I'll show you that theory, and then I'll show you some maps for the United States about how the Trump tariff has impacted different states around the United States, including the steel tariff. Okay? So I want to look at import tariffs at the state level, and the huge big assumption I want to make, but I think it's realistic, is tariff revenues are distributed on a per capita basis. So we all get the same tariff revenues because really we're not getting them in dollars, we're getting them in the form of public goods, government services, post office, military, clean air, right? Those are all public goods funded by tax revenue, including tariff revenue. So this is going to make a huge difference. States that import more are not getting more revenue. They're just getting their national share, right, based on their population. That's the assumption. It's going to make a big difference, okay? If they were getting revenue, tariff revenue, based on how much they imported, then that earlier diagram I showed you is still going to hold. But that's just not how it works, right? Federal government collects the revenue, goes into the Treasury, they spend it on whatever, let's say it's public goods. Now, so that's my big assumption. Just to make my diagram simple, let's suppose all 50 states have the same population, so they get the same tariff revenue, and I'll assume they all have the same demand. So there's no big states and small states. This is just strictly for the supply and demand diagrams I'm going to show you in a minute. And then when I go to my calculations, of course, states are different size, right? So I won't make this assumption. But just to try and show you some diagrams, I'll make this assumption. So states will be the same size, 50 of them, therefore they have the same demand, right? Because they have the same population. So what they differ in is in their supply of the good. Some states are steel producers, some are not steel producers. That's really the idea. So I want to contrast a state producing no steel, what happens when you raise that tariff on steel, versus a state that is producing steel. What happens when you raise that tariff on steel? That's the idea. This won't take us too long. And then, like I say, we can look at some new calculations I've made for the United States. Okay, this is just to remind you of what that national diagram I had showed you. I didn't even say it was a national diagram, but it was. That was the country as a whole. So how do we get a state? In particular, how do we get a state demand? Let's just divide everything in that diagram by 50. So I'll take that US demand curve, divide it by 50. All these demand points here, D1, D2, supply points, S1, S2, divide those by 50. That C triangle of tariff revenue, just divide that by 50. Same with A and B and C. That's the idea. What's going to differ is this supply curve. I do not divide the supply curve by 50. That would only be true if each state had the same supply, and I do not want to consider that case. I want to consider some states with no supply, some states with lots of supply. It adds up to that national supply curve, but states differ in their supplies. So here's a state with no supply. No supply, so I got no supply curve. I got my US demand curve. Just take that national demand curve, divide it by 50. I got my two demand points, divided those by 50. There's my tariff revenue divided by 50. And I even have those areas A, B, C, D. Each of those are divided by 50. So here's a state. It's got the tariff, right? The price has gone up here from PW to PW plus the tariff. Price has gone up. We got a drop in consumer surplus of that entire amount. A plus B plus C plus D, all divided by 50. There's your drop in consumer surplus. That's what I'm showing here. You've got no producer surplus because this state does not produce this product. Let's just call it steel. This demand curve from steel comes from industries using steel in that industry. That's where the demand curve, it's really a demand curve from other firms, but you've got no firms producing steel, no producer surplus. You do have your revenue, but you just get your state share, C over 50, right? The fact that you're actually a big importer of steel just doesn't matter, doesn't give you any more revenue, right? You're importing that steel from other states, you're importing it from Pennsylvania, does not give you more revenue. You just get your 1/50 a share. So now when you add these up, you got the falling in consumer surplus, no producer surplus, add that C, you end up with a rather big loss, negative A plus B plus D over 50. That's that whole red area there. So this state is losing a lot from the tariff on steel. It's sort of, not that surprising. It's what you'd expect, but it's just not a diagram we're very used to seeing. So there's the loss for a steel importing state, even though it's just importing from other states. It could be importing from abroad too, but it could just be importing from other states, right? That's its loss. Now let's contrast that with a state that does produce steel. So I'm gonna give this state a supply curve. I'll just call that S. That's just this state supply curve. It could lie almost anywhere here. Just to make my diagram easy, I've pretended that at this free trade price, this state just supplies its own demand. That's that intersection of supply and demand at the price PW. So this is not a state that produces very much steel. It just produces enough to supply its own industries at this intersection of supply and demand. Now let the world price go up. World price goes up. Supply increases. You used to be here at S1, now we're at S2. You've got a big drop in consumer surplus, same as before, A plus B plus C plus D over 50, that whole area to the left of the demand curve. But now you've got a big rise in producer surplus. It's the whole area to the left of the supply curve, right? That whole area sliced in between the two prices to the left of the supply curve, A plus B plus C plus D over 50, plus this area E. right? That's a rise in producer surplus. They're better off by selling more and producing more and selling it to other states. You still got your 1/50th share of tariff revenue, so this state is much better off by its tariff revenue, C over 50, plus these pure gains for producers. So there's no losses in this state at all, right? If you want to get some votes in Pennsylvania or Indiana or West Virginia, put a tariff on steel, right? You know, those states are going to be much better off by doing that. No losses at all. And if your supply curve, if your industry supply curve is either even further to the right, then the same idea would apply. This state would be much better off. So that's what I want to put in my undergraduate textbook, these new diagrams, right? What happens at the state level? And it's sort of a way to think about the politics of tariff, right? You're going to hurt some states, you're going to help others, and maybe you're going to try and buy votes that way, right? The way George Bush did. So I try to put some numbers on here, and that's what I want to talk about in the rest of my talk. Do we go to 4:15? 4:15, so I'll talk for a little while longer. There'll be time for questions as you have. I'm sort of easing into the last part of it, and these are some new calculations. Yesterday, I was actually at the U.S. International Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., and I showed them these same calculations I'm showing you right now. Take it for granted that they're not quite perfect yet, right? These staff at the U.S. International Trade Commission didn't like all the tariffs I was using and questioned me on some of my tariffs, and I didn't quite have the answers yet, right? But I think the general idea is fine. So what did I do? I collected a bunch of data on tariffs. That's publicly available. Here's a graph of average tariffs in the United States. So the blue line is a simple average. There's about 10,000 goods that we import. By that I mean there's 10,000 categories that customs keeps track of, right? And every good that's imported has to be in one of those categories. So there's 10,000 potential tariffs. So if I just take an average over those 10,000, here's what's happened to tariffs, falling a little, pretty low on average, you know, here's 3.6%, and then increasing a little with Trump. Those include, those 10,000, those include lots of zeros. When we import from Canada, that's a zero tariff. When we import from Mexico, that's a zero tariff. So the reason that those are so low is there's lots of zeros. That's 10,000 tariffs in a bunch of different countries, 200 countries. So that's 10,000 times 200, I guess that's 2 million that I'm averaging over. So that includes all the zero tariffs. If you ignore the zero tariffs and you just say, well, what's the amount that we import that's potentially subject to a non-zero tariff, so subject to some duty, and that's your dutiable value, and what's the duty you collect, and you take that ratio, then that's the average tariffs on goods subject to tariffs, or countries subject to tariffs. That's what this red line is. And it starts somewhat higher because you're ignoring Canada here that's not paying any tariff. You're ignoring Mexico. And then it really shoots up with the Trump tariffs. So that's the tariffs on goods and countries that are paying tariffs. So that's actually a pretty big increase. Before that, it is decreasing some, and that's due to these free trade areas. And between 2002 and 2022, there's lots of them. U.S.-Israel is earlier, 1985. U.S., of course, has a free trade area with Israel, and one of the early ones. But since 2000, well, there's one with Jordan, Chile, Singapore, Australia, Morocco, Bahrain, Dominican Republic, Oman, Peru, Korea, Colombia, Panama, and here's U.S.-Mexico free trade area, which was a new name for NAFTA, which was actually signed by President Clinton. But these are pretty recent. This one, of course, was signed by President Trump, who didn't like NAFTA and figured he could negotiate a better deal, right? You know, so he negotiated USMCA. So the thing to keep in mind, and in the first part of this period, tariffs are falling, and then they're rising under Trump. You know, so NAFTA, these tariffs were already zero. So the things that were renegotiated didn't have so much things to do with tariffs, but other aspects of trade, right? So these were zero before and after. Okay, so there's the tariffs. Here's a table where I give you just some specific examples. So I have these at an industry level, and then I look at 2007 to 17, and then 17 to 21. So this is under Trump, 17 to 21. 2007 to 17, that's the 10 years before Trump. Okay, and then I took the top 12 industries with declining tariffs in 2007-17. Alcoholic beverages was declining the most. And then I put those same industries in the next period. Remember, Trump put tariffs on Scotch whiskey, and something else must have gone up here. So we did have an increase in the tariff on whiskey. Some agricultural goods, but I also want to highlight there are also some high-tech goods here, transport equipment or electronics, precision instruments, pharmaceuticals. And then this is the top 12 increases before Trump and after Trump, when they're really going up a lot more. I would have thought this one would be higher because this should be steel, but for some reason it's up here in non-metal mineral products. I'm kind of surprised at what's happening with the price of crude petroleum, and so were the people at the US ITC, so they don't really believe my numbers there, so that's fine. I got to double check that, but at least for the calculation today, I have the tariff on crude petroleum going up initially and then down. So that's the opposite of the general pattern. The general pattern or tariffs are going down and then up. Oops, I didn't do a very good job there. The general pattern or tariffs are going down. You can see it here, down and then up. So let's see what we get when I do these calculations. This is exactly those diagrams I showed you. So here's the consumer surplus change. Tariffs are going down in the first period. So consumer surplus is going up. That's the positive area, the green area. Texas is an exception. There's weird things going on with the tariff on oil, so let's just ignore Texas, okay? And then in the second period, tariffs are going up. That's the Trump tariff. Most consumer surplus, therefore, is going down. Texas and California show up as the biggest just because they have the biggest population. I haven't corrected for state size here, right? I could do that, but I just haven't done that. So there's the change in consumer surplus state by state. Here's producer surplus. So tariffs are going down in the first period. So you do have some states losing there, with tariffs going down. Here tariffs are going up, so producers are better off. Again, the big states show up the most, but just because they're big. Then we have tariff revenue, and that I just give on a per capita basis, meaning big states get more. So I'm just giving the states the revenue, the extra revenue over these 10 years and then over these 4 years. So the difference in colors just reflects the different size of the states. And then we can put it all together. So this adds up, change in consumer surplus, change in producer surplus, change in tariff revenue on a per capita basis. So what do we see? So this first period, again, tariffs were going down. Importing states, if you're an importer state, you benefit from that. So you see some states here that are green. But if you're an exporter state, if you have states with more, with lots of production in those industries where tariffs going down, you're going to lose. So California, my home state right now, that could be the drop in tariffs on high-tech goods there. Okay? So the free trade agreements that we signed in those 10 years impacted states differentially. Right? Some winners, some losers. Maybe more winners than losers. Yes, more winners than losers. National total surplus. When I add it up across all states, I get 8.7 billion. So yeah, you're better off due to the low tariffs. That's why economists like low tariffs. But you got a range of opinions across these states you're in. Then, how about the Trump tariffs, 2017 to 21? So I do get a national loss, so it kind of, fits the model, fits the theory. Tariffs go up, in the national diagram, you got that deadweight loss. But look at this variation across states. And here's Pennsylvania, green. It is winning, probably from this steel tariff. And Ohio and Indiana. Those are actually the same states that George Bush was trying to protect with the steel tariff way back in 2000. So we do have some really interesting variation across states. Texas is a big loser because I think the tariff on oil fell here. California, a bit of a winner there. You'd have to go really carefully through and look at those tariffs. So politically, it's really the Rust Belt states, if I can use that terms, that are being protected here with the Trump tariffs. Okay, let me wrap up with some conclusions. Presidents use tariffs a lot. Now, Trump used it more than others, right? But he is hardly the first president to use tariffs. At a national level, a tariff leads to a deadweight loss, and that's why economists don't like it, because the consumer cost exceeds the sum of the producer gain and the tariff revenue gain. But at a state level, the story is very different. Tariff is going to lead to a gain for states that produce somewhat more of that product, a loss for states that produce less or zero of it. Tariffs imposed by President Trump, and I was combining all the tariffs there, did favor producers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and some other neighboring states. And lots of heterogeneous effects across states. But what I haven't included here in the calculation is the losses imposed from foreign retaliation. And I already hinted at one of those. I said that India put a tariff against Washington state apples. Or it was against apples, but it really affected Washington state, right? So that foreign retaliation absolutely imposes losses that I haven't calculated, and those can be substantial. So this can lead to political gains for politicians. This could lead to political losses. I'm actually going to argue tonight that these political losses could even overwhelm these political gains, but that's more than I want to do on this lecture. That's a story for another day. So let me stop there in terms of tariffs, and I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, where? Oh, please.
You made all the states equal population. Have you ever went in and did all 50 states with their population?
So in these diagrams, they're different. These diagrams, absolutely different. Absolutely different. That was just for this super simple, just so I could kind of give you the idea here of how that 1/50th share of tariff revenue works. Yes, but in these diagrams, in these, so it's just in the theory. In these maps, they're definitely different, and that's why California and Texas just show up it's so dark in these, because they're such big states. When they're winning a lot because there's so many people in those states, yeah. So these definitely have the different size states. Oh, one more? Thank you, please.
What president in recent history do you think went about tariffs the best?
The best. Clinton negotiated the World Trade Organization. Before that, it was called the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That was an institution that was established after World War II. So the WTO was broader and was supposed to help in areas beyond just tariffs, like environment and other areas. So I liked it So I think, and I liked NAFTA under Clinton, even though it was kind of, so I think Clinton was the best, but I'm going to get voted off the island for that, right? You know, because many people would disagree with me. They didn't like NAFTA and they don't like WTO. And in fact, Trump disliked WTO so much, the United States has refused to appoint people to the WTO. I think they're called judges because they judge cases. You know, the WTO country brings a case, you need some judges. I think they're called judges or some word like that. Trump has refused to appoint them, so the WTO can't decide any cases anymore. I mean, it's almost neutralized, right? You know, so I'm going to pick Clinton, but my choice isn't popular. Yeah. Please.
To follow up on sort of your discussion of the WTO,
Mm-hmm.
do you think it acted as a good response to the major economic changes that were occurring, you know, basically so the economy ended the Cold War? Do you think it reacted well or poorly in terms of the international community's response to all these changes?
In Cold War, at least WTO is not a rich person's club. Just about everybody's in the WTO. Russia's in the WTO, right? You know, China joined in 2001. I'm going to talk about that tonight. What country joined the day after China? What country was allowed to join the day after China? Taiwan. Wouldn't have allowed it in, right? It had to be in there first, right? You know, that's just a side note. So I think the WTO, it's well represented. There's lots of smaller countries belong to it. You know, I don't know how it really handled the Cold War, but I think of it as kind of the UN kind of, but of course people don't like the UN either. But so I think the WTO has done okay. It was supposed to help on environmental issues, and there's certainly some examples where it has helped on environmental issues. But inevitably, people resent having some other international organization decide things for them, right? You know, so not just Trump, but maybe other people in the United States resent having the WTO make decisions that impact us and so on. So I think it's done well, but it's not doing that well right now today because the United States has refused to appoint new judges. And I don't have that word quite right, but new people there to decide cases. Please. You know, it's really Trump that didn't appoint them. So you're absolutely right. I haven't kept up in the last 2+ years to see if Biden has restored those. So yes, I was just referring to Trump, and I haven't checked that since then. Yeah, yeah. Please.
So, there is, I feel like there is certain strategic value that goes beyond consumer and producer surplus in producing certain goods in the United States, such as steel, for example. So when we're talking about importing toys versus importing steel, we somehow, I think, should separate the two, right? And so I wonder how does this idea would factor into this analysis, having in mind that certain goods must be produced in the United States for security reasons.
Well, that's what Biden is working on with the CHIPS Act, right? Encouraging production of semiconductors in the United States. And I can definitely see it, and I don't know how to factor it in, right? You know, I think it's a significant idea, more on semiconductors than steel, I have to admit, because I'm totally okay buying steel from Canada, you know. Also because semiconductors, you know, there's only a few very big firms, very oligopolistic market and stuff like that. You know, you don't have many semiconductor fabrication plants as you have steel plants, you know. It's hard to get the raw materials, you know, so it is a super important industry. So yeah, I think it's important, but I don't know how to factor it in. Should be factored in, yeah. Uh-huh.
One quick question. Professor, you just mentioned in your conclusion that the substantial loss from this type of foreign retaliation might outweigh the potential gain, political gain. I'm just curious, how are you able to identify this type of political gain? Because you're kind of comparing oranges with apples. Just,
I'll show you tonight.
oh,
I'll have some graphs on that, but it was just too much for this lecture. It's a little bit, I'll just say, it's a little bit of a, I'll just be quoting a research study where people correlate the protection given a state or districts with how that impacted their votes, or the retaliation given a state or district with how that could have impacted their votes. So ultimately, you compare them, what was the net result on votes? So it's sort of a political economy analysis. That's the direction I'll take it. That's how I put them into a common denominator, yeah. Okay, thanks very much.